Hello, hello. Welcome, everyone. I am joined today by my very, very dear friend, Michael Grova, who currently is a real estate developer. Michael is someone that I believe is a really good example and could be very inspirational to anyone who is looking to just completely get into a totally different career. So, Michael's former career was in the corporate world, and then he transitioned out of that, and then many things occurred that led to him stepping into the world of design, interior design, beautiful spaces, and now he is a real estate developer. And on a personal note, Michael and I are very old friends. We've known each other since I was a teenager. So he's a long-standing person in my life, and I'm very excited to have him on today. So thank you, Michael, for joining
Thanks
us.
for the introduction, Megan. It's good to see your face. And I'll just let the audience know it's 7 a.m. here. I'm in California. And
And it's 3 p.m. in London. So, but we're both having coffee.
cheers.
Yeah.
Which is probably where we should start. Coffee is a good part of your day. Enjoy,
Yes,
enjoy the little
definitely.
moments, especially if you're on the
Yeah.
entrepreneur's journey, because it can be tough.
Mm, yes. If you become an entrepreneur and you've not had coffee, it's unlikely that will last. Welcome, Michael. And could you give everyone a little bit more information about where you're from? So, like your cultural background, where you grew up in the world, and what kind of were your early experiences that shaped you into you?
Well, so my mother was American. She's many generations here, but my father was Italian. He's passed. So my father immigrated from Sicily, Italy, came over when he was 5, which set up an interesting dynamic. If any of your listeners are from immigrant families, definitely from an immigrant family. And so that was our very humble beginnings. Um, when he went through the war, he got the GI Bill and actually got into photography and was driving a Jeep during that period of time for the military. But when he got out, he went to art school. And why that's important and his background is important to me is because I grew up the son of an immigrant artist. And that is a defining characteristic of my early childhood that's non traditional, not like most folks. Their journey. And, as an artist, he was also a bit of an entrepreneur because he was selling and marketing his art as well, which the sculptor later became a painter, was a sculptor in his early days and worked for the university in Santa Cruz, where I grew up, which is in California. So I grew up with the arts as part of my life. I didn't really know how to play baseball because my father didn't introduce me to that. But by the time I was 8, I had done my first bronze casting, which is a unique thing that many people never get.
Wow.
Yeah, it was.
I wouldn't even know how to, like, I don't think I've ever done a bronze
Nor
casting.
would you. I mean, it's just one of these things. So yeah, I did my first abstract sculpture when I was 8 years old, and it's a very cool sculpture. It's around somewhere. I don't have it anymore, but someone in my family
Wow.
does. Yeah, and then from there, that kind of set me up, going to museums when I was very young. My parents took me to Europe and we saw museums and churches and was exposed to a lot of stuff, which, of course, when you're a child, you can't really appreciate, but later it does have an impact. So for those parents that are thinking about taking that trip to
Mm.
Europe, your kids might not appreciate it at the moment, but they will later. For me, then the journey continued on to undergraduate, where I studied art and economics. I did a double major because I really didn't know what I want to do. And I think the lesson for all of us in that is sometimes you just don't know. And I think as Americans, we often feel like we have to know and have to have all the answers. I think this is a defining kind of core principle of my life, which is it's okay not to have all of the answers, and you can still be very successful You just have to kind of trust in yourself. So yeah, I did the undergraduate work in San Diego, California, and then went on and did a graduate degree. I did a graduate degree in business rather than in art, primarily because I already had some early responsibilities in my life. I was supporting my girlfriend and trying to live a little higher means than what I had grown up as, and in the environment that I grown up. We didn't have a lot of resources when I was young. So, trying to do something different. And so business became a part of my life and dual brain. It was a very confusing time actually to try to understand how the left and the right side of my brain were working together and how I could bring both creativity and financial acumen into the same storyline. It took many years for
Mm,
me to figure that thread out and went back and forth between something much more creative and something much more traditional in finance, corporate finance specifically, which is when you and I met. I was on that journey working for a energy company in Africa, which is maybe an interesting transition in terms of thread of life. I think one of your core questions that you sent to me before we started the session was kind of a rock bottom moment, which
yeah.
followed by several interesting moments in my life. So I don't know the demographic of your audience, male to female, but for me as a male, my experience very young was that I wanted to actually have some success financially and be able to support myself. Most important, that was a very important thread for me. I'm not sure why. When I was in my early 20s, I wanted to be able to demonstrate that I was on my own and was able to care for myself. And in that case, I was also caring for someone else, my partner who was in school.
Yeah.
So, um, working very, very hard at a job I didn't love, which is often our 20s. I was doing mortgage
Yeah.
banking and got a job in that field, but it was 100% commission, so it was very, very stressful. I'd also just,
Ugh,
yeah, I had just come out of a situation.
I could not do
Yeah.
that.
Yeah. But I had also already put myself through the last couple of years of school. I hadn't had a lot of help with that. My parents were unable to do that, but my grandfather did give me a little bit of help. But I worked painting the exterior of homes, nothing fancy. Went to school year round, and I had actually already had some experience kind of supporting myself, but at a relatively low level. And I had jobs all through high school as well as playing sports at an early age. But when I graduated, it was okay, can we do this at another level? And it was really hard. That was a very, very challenging time of my life, a lot of uncertainty. You're still trying to figure out your personality and all what you like and don't like, and trying to be in my first committed relationship and living
Hmm.
together she was in her early 20s and I was now in my mid 20s.
Yeah, and that relationship really shaped you.
It did. It was the my
You told me about that, very shortly after we first met. I remember you talking about it, and it has impacted you through the years, as I think first relationships often
I
do.
think so too. Um, I think
Yeah.
if I was to try to tell the story of career change without mentioning relationships and how they impact us, I think that many of my
Mm,
career decisions have often been impacted by where I was in my personal life and what was happening in my closest relationships. Uh,
100%. Same here. Yeah.
So, rock bottom moment would have been leading up to kind of that, which was the question. Rock bottom moment was when that relationship broke up, or when we broke up. I was a couple of years into my first entrepreneurial adventure. I had my own mortgage banking firm with two partners. We had roughly 20 employees, people that were working with us on our mortgage work, three partners, so me and two other guys. And we were very young. I was probably 25. I think one of the guys was 26 or 27, and my other partner was 25 as well. But we were working hard, trying to make it all work out. At the same time, that relationship that I just mentioned ended, and it really just lost its meaning for me. I also, as an aside, even at this time, which was the late 90s, I could see that the mortgage industry was in trouble. That then came to pass, and we had 2000.
You had some foresight as to what was to come.
Everybody acts like it was a super complex situation, but we were doing 100% mortgages or more. It was fine when the market was increasing, but as soon as the market decreased, of course, everyone was going to default on those loans, which is what happened. But that moment in time was a bit of rock bottom because my personal relationship kind of fell apart. And then my work really didn't feel like it had meaning anymore to me. I wasn't enjoying working with one of the two partners anymore. He was doing things that I thought were very sketchy and didn't want to be a part of that anymore, which again is part of that mortgage story. If you watched those movies, The Big Short and others, about how that unraveled.
Yeah.
I was definitely a part of that, which was an interesting time, but I chose not to. So I extricated myself from that. Didn't know what to do. I had actually had the opportunity because we had had some financial success to buy some real estate in San Diego, which I did. I bought 3 or 4 homes at that time and was renting them out to college students and other people. They weren't making a ton of money, but it was a project I could sink my teeth into as I transitioned out of mortgage finance. I found that.
It's also, that's a really good, I hear that a lot, like for people who are rigid, like starting to dip their toes into investments, that real estate investments that you're not going to live in, that are just like smaller projects like that you can rent out. That's a really good starter way into real estate. I hear that on a lot of financial podcasts.
Real estate has been a part of my life, kind of through that time till now. I didn't know how to monetize it properly at that time, and it really felt like owning that real estate at that time was more stressful than supporting. Now my real
Mm,
estate adventures, they support me and other people that are involved in our activities, but there was a long learning curve for me, and I took a lot of time to figure that out. And in between, um, there was this rock bottom moment and coming out of that. And the coming out of that was I made the decision to go to graduate school. When in doubt, sometimes more education is the way to go. I don't know that I would recommend graduate school, in my case, an MBA. For people today, I think we're in a different environment where you can learn.
yeah, and it's like 100 grand.
Yeah. I think you can learn many of the skill sets. What you can't necessarily get is the networking, but there are other
Mm,
ways to do that. Um, in any case, that led to kind of coming out of that rock bottom and some adventures that ensued, one of which was getting an academic fellowship and going to Africa, which is where we met.
yeah. Where in Africa did you start? Like that's so having prior to that you had never lived outside of the United States,
That's
right?
correct. And the defining moment there was that coming out of that very hard time at the end of that relationship, I asked myself, okay, so this person that you've been with for 5 years, is first love of your life, this is not who you're going to marry and have children with. And that was the trajectory we were on. And so there's been a change. And that change was now I was asking myself different questions. And, I think the quality of the questions that we ask ourselves is also a major defining element of how we live our lives.
Mm,
And in my case, the question that I remember asking myself, or the desire that I wanted, was how can I live an adventurous life? What is the most adventurous life that I can conceive of myself at this stage? And for me, that was living and working overseas, not just being a traveler. I wanted to live and work overseas. And the internet was just kind of getting going at the time. I just dated myself. But I went to the computer
mm.
lab at my university and figured out how to use the internet, first real time that I used it.
Did you dial up?
Yeah, of course, that's how everything was.
Yeah.
Yeah, with the modem and all the noises, which much of perhaps your audience doesn't know those things. But in any case, I made the difficult. The choice to do something difficult was try to figure this out. And I found at that time, which is probably still true today, that probably the easiest pathway to live and work overseas is either as a teacher or a student. And I still had one class left on my MBA, so was able to find an academic fellowship, applied for it, got it, and as part of that fellowship, they were sending people overseas, and they gave me the position in Uganda, Africa. I did not know where that was. They said, "Here's the work." It was micro savings and
Hmm.
credit. Work with
It's okay.
rural women's groups and trying to help bring them up out of poverty through using tools like savings and credit. Um, that was the fellowship that I was going to be working on. These entities that were in Uganda that were trying to start up and do microfinance and supporting them. And so that was the work. I did that for 10 months. Did not know where Uganda was when they offered me that position. But again, in keeping with this defining idea of adventure, I was like, let's do it. And it was perhaps one of the more exciting adventures that I have had, even at this point. That was many years ago, but that was 25 years ago. But to go there, to live there, to figure out how to be there and thrive there was an interesting challenge to present myself with, and it was great, and I loved it.
Yeah, it was amazing. I remember not knowing a huge amount about Uganda before I went, and knowing I wanted to do my gap year in Africa, but not knowing exactly where. And I thought I wanted jungle. I wanted like more like kind of lush, yeah, like jungle vibes rather than like anything kind of deserty. So I looked along the equator and I was like, yeah, there. I want to go there. So that was like the depth. I had a couple of friends that went to school with me as well that had grown up in Uganda, so I'd heard stories, but I had never been. So,
Amazing place,
yeah.
incredible people. I stayed. I did that year of fellowship work. I was actually getting paid as part of that academic fellowship. So it wasn't like I was doing it for free or as a Peace Corps person, something like that. I was mid-career already in their
Mhm.
eyes, so I was getting paid. But you know, careers take odd turns sometimes, and often it's about who you meet when. As I was halfway through that fellowship and that work and really enjoying the country and being there and how it was expanding me and opening my eyes to new possibilities and ways of thinking, I also met some people playing ultimate frisbee that
Mhm.
were working on a hydroelectric dam and hydroelectric dam for electricity in a country that was constrained by electricity or the lack thereof. And I thought, well, this is really interesting. What these people are working on is very interesting. So as I got to know them better and my time with the fellowship ended, I sought opportunities to work with them and to continue to stay in Uganda working on that project, which ultimately I did. And it was an entry point for, the next kind of over 10 years of my working career, but I ended up becoming the environmental manager of that project, which was,
Yeah, you were it environment was that your title, environmental manager? I thought you were a project
I had a
manager
few
or
different
something like
titles. I worked on that project for
yeah.
over 3 years. And um, as I got better at what I did, and then as resources came and left, and I needed to fill different roles, there were a number of different titles. But at one point in time, um, my role was the environmental manager, and what that meant was I didn't have an environmental degree. I was more focused on properly or to the best of our ability compensating the local population for the loss of land and agriculture as a result of the backflooding of the dam. And so trying to figure that out at a time where, indigenous people or people in similar situations around the world were not being very well taken care of. So it was an interesting
Yeah.
challenge to work on that. I had a team of about 40 people working on it with me, underneath me. And, we did the best we could. If you asked me, was that a success? I think in terms of the company, it was a success. I think it would be with any development work, you would have to evaluate it through time. And I haven't been back. I do know the power plant is up and operational, and they do have electricity.
Yeah.
But I think we'd have to go back and talk to the individuals that were impacted by it to see if that work was a success. But I worked very hard at it, and I did try.
Yeah, well, and I would say from a professional standpoint, managing a team of 40 people is pretty huge.
Yeah, there was.
I would not want to do that. I don't even want to manage one
It was
person.
a big project, and it required, a lot of bodies to properly compensate for the loss of agriculture, and even just to, figure out who we needed to compensate. And there were constant pressures from, the community to corrupt that system. Um, in the end, I think we did a reasonable job given the difficult environment and circumstances. Um, and I loved that time of my life. It was, a really fascinating time. In the end, I was there almost 5 years, um, almost four working on that project, and then a year doing the microfinance work. And then I had enough of that. It was interesting that I knew I loved it there and I loved my time there, but there was something in me that thought, okay, this is now easy and I'm comfortable here. I went from being incredibly uncomfortable when I first went there to at the end, it was probably one of the more comfortable places I've been in my life in terms of my friend
Hmm.
community and, monetary resources that I had, how I was being paid versus what things cost. And, I lived in a compound. I had staff. I had cars and drivers, to support me in the work that I was doing there. So life was fairly straightforward and pretty easy, but to the point where I'm like, okay, I'm kind of languishing now. I'm not growing anymore. And it started to be concerning to me. And I saw other people in the community not progressing past that point in time. And I thought, I'm not looking for that myself. So let's try to find the next adventure. And these moments, they're always stressful for all of us. And these are the transition
Hmm.
moments that everyone has in their career. But for me, anyway, they were the defining moments, often through wanting to move out of an uncomfortable situation. I wish I could say that most of my transitions were to move towards something that I dreamed of or wanted more. And that there's a certain element of that. But often for all of us, I think there's a moment in time where we're trying to move away from some pain, and until that pain gets big enough, we don't make a change. And I have a high capacity for pain, it turns out. And so I
Yeah.
can stay in situations that are uncomfortable or unpleasant for quite a while. But at the end of the day, these are when our transitions are made, when we have had enough difficulty that we're ready to do something else. Again, I would love to say that I've made my transitions through going for something else, but often I didn't know what I was moving to.
Yeah, I find it's kind of twofold the pain sort of pushing you. So one, I'm hearing that you are clearly listening to a bit of your intuition slash soul longing for something more or something different. So, sort of knowing when it's time. But then also something that I've seen repeatedly now, well, from my own lived experience, but also with a lot of the guests that I've had on, is that when they're like, oh, I'm not ready to sort of acknowledge that it's time for me to go, then things start to get like it just doesn't feel good or something happens so that they're forced to kind of look at the situation and be like, right, okay, well now I actually have to go. So you were hearing the whispers that it was time for a
Yeah,
change.
yeah, and
Yeah.
that did happen. As I was transitioning out of that, I was working in Africa for a major U.S. based corporation, multinational, Um, and so there had been a lot of safety in that, and then deciding that I A wasn't going to work with them anymore, and B didn't want to really do that kind of work anymore because I was starting to feel I hold two passports, an Italian passport and an American passport. And I was starting to challenge the questions, having lived overseas, for a while, starting to challenge questions about, you know, where I wanted to live and what I wanted to do. I stayed in it for another couple years. I went to Cameroon. I did another project there. That was challenging in a different way. I didn't have
That was a hard one, right?
Yeah, I didn't have the same friend network there. It was a closed country, so you were really foreigners were really or expats were only there to do work, as opposed to Uganda, where there were many tourists and travelers and other people that were coming and going from the country. In Cameroon, it was a closed country, and I was really just doing work. I had elevated in my career to a different level than when I was in Uganda. So there was a lot of positive change that happened there with respect to my career. But in terms of personally, I didn't enjoy that as much. It was really just work all the time. So coming out of that kind of 7 year run in Africa, I started asking different questions again.
Oh,
What do I want? Where do I want to live? And who do I want to be? And I was being offered other positions in a similar role at another level um, in other parts of the world, like Romania and Nigeria. And I could have continued that story, but instead I decided that I would take a beat and try to figure out what the next thing was. Little did I know I needed to come back to the US. A family member was graduating from college, and I wanted to attend that. So came back and realized, okay, you're feeling a little untethered and lost in the world. You need to take a beat. And so I did. I was also kind of living in Rome at the time while I was trying to figure that out. Did I want to be Italian? Did I want to be American?
yeah.
And so I stayed in Rome for 3 or maybe 4 months, taking some language lessons and just giving myself the time and the space to try to kind of figure out what would be the next move. And I think that's an important maybe thread as well, is that, again, I started the conversation with we feel often, I think, that we have to have all the answers. And the reality is we just don't. And we make the best decisions we
Yeah.
can with the information that we have at the time, and we try things. I think it's important to just try things. And if they're not working, you pivot to something else, constantly kind of be iterating and pivoting. And probably, was from another one of your very good questions that you queued up is, you know, in all of this transitioning through different career choices, kind of what's been the hardest thing. And I think the hardest thing
Mm-hmm.
for me, anyway, and maybe it's true of other people, is our own identity of ourselves, how we see ourselves in the world. Like, I am X, I do Y. And
Yeah.
I think when we do that, there's a lot of positive that comes out. We identify, and then we can get notoriety in a certain career choice or career path. And we have to identify ourselves that way to be taken seriously by other people and start to get into those networks and build those relationships. But the other side of that is that it can be limiting. Um, uh, from that point in time coming back to the US, I got into the private equity world and traversed that ladder through
Yeah.
wind energy and then solar energy before all of that was a sexy, or maybe it's not anymore, but it was for a period of time in terms of industry and what to be a part of. Um, and then I realized in my case that I hadn't really asked myself some other important questions, which were I had started this journey wanting an adventurous life. I had lived an adventurous life, lived 7 years in Africa, and then was in Europe for a period of time where I had the choice to kind of stay there permanently. Came back to the U.S. for this graduation, and then decided, wow, you're really untethered. You need to reconnect with your roots, and you are American. Let's own that for a little while. You can still enjoy being overseas, but my time overseas had helped me understand who I was in the context of where I had grown up. And that was a really interesting thing that I hadn't really realized was going to happen with so much time overseas. But the reality there was I continued to pursue my career, but I hadn't asked myself what now I see as a very, very important question, which is where is this leading? And is that life
Yeah.
that you want and you're going to be happy with? So this would be another offering to your community, um, which is as we start things, I think we have to ask ourselves, well, or assume that we're going to be successful at whatever it is that we're pursuing. And then look ahead 3 years, 5 years, and ask yourself, okay, other people are on this trajectory too. And I have some models
Yeah.
and examples of what success looks like if I take this path. Do I want to emulate that life? Is that a life that I like? Is this a person that I admire and respect? And if the answer is yes, great, then pursue that. In my case, when I pursued my career in corporate finance post the time in Africa and I ended up working with a private equity firm, and then I was the director of mergers and acquisitions for the largest solar company in the world at the time. I didn't ask those questions. I was just one step
Yeah.
at a time plodding ahead and, if you will, climbing the ladder. And I found myself C-suite at a corporate position in a major player in an industry that I wanted to be in, basically at the top, working with people that I really didn't care for very much, and more importantly, being a version of myself that I didn't care for very much. I was very sharky. I was swimming in a tank full of sharks. These were very high
Yeah.
attorneys, lawyers.
I feel like I recall as well, it was so different from what like you had experienced in Africa where you really were your own, you sort of managed yourself, if you will. You were able to make all the big decisions, but I remember when you were in these final days in the US, it felt like you were being micromanaged a bit, which for where you were at your career stage, like wasn't gonna work for you
Yeah,
either.
that was the transition before the last one when I worked for the private equity firm, which, um,
Yeah.
you know, in that and then in my subsequent role as director of mergers and acquisitions, there were interesting moments, one of which was that people would reach out to me on behalf of their kids who were in college, and even those kids that were in college or their parents. How do you get, how did you get to where you are? And uh,
Yeah.
with the concept that they wanted to achieve that as well. And I remember thinking to myself, well, I didn't take a traditional path, first of all, so I can't really, I can share with you my journey, but you're going to have your own. And I think that's so true of most people's lives. There are very step by step trajectories to things, but the reality is, I think we live, and in my case, I can speak for myself. I tried to make my own choices and decisions, not based on some pattern, but on what I was feeling and the direction I wanted to
Yeah.
go in my life. And now I very much make choices based on, okay, what's this going to lead to? What's my life going to look like if this path is successful, and is that a life that I want? But there was another moment in time where I had reached this C-suite level, and I knew I didn't want to be working with these people anymore, primarily because I didn't love the version of myself that I felt like I had to be in order to be successful in that environment. And so, without a lot of understanding on what I would do next, in fact, I jokingly used to say I'm going to be a very well educated bartender or something somewhere, because I don't want to stay in the corporate world or in the corporate life. And this is what I know. It was my identity. I That's what I did. That's how people knew me, and I had a lot of success and
Yeah.
accolades and economic. You know, they were paying me very, very well to do what I did. And so, but there was a time where I knew it was over and I had to leave that at a very high cost, kind of to me, personally in terms of the challenge that it presented in my life to make that pivot. So that was another moment in time. There was the college time, and then there was the going to Africa time, and there was leaving Africa time, and then
Hmm.
there was the success in the US and another. These are all challenging moments. And in many of them, like I said, I was leaving something that I didn't love anymore for an unknown that I did not know. And that's hard to do. It's hard to do in our personal relationships,
The
hard to
unknown.
do in our work, not to leave the partner or lover that we've been with for years, even if, when we know it's not necessarily working out for us anymore. But the scariness of the unknown and the uncertainty of the abyss.
The brain hates change, so it will always cling to what it knows, even if what it knows is not good for it. The brain will always do that over the void of the unknown. So that's just good information for people to have if they haven't realized that already. What was the major final turning point that then started your trajectory into design?
Yeah.
How would you describe that time
Well,
period?
I'd been dissatisfied with corporate life for a few years at that point. But in terms of success, I kept achieving more in the corporate world. I would say that the pull away took a number of years. And when I finally made the decision was at the same time that I bought another home in San Francisco, and I had a large financial commitment at the same time that I made the decision to leave my job, and I had to figure out how to make that work. I did have some resources to draw on, but not for, not indefinitely. I had a little bit of time. So I had built up a cushion to try to figure it out. And so over the course of the next, I would say, year and a half or so, 2 years, one could argue even maybe longer until I really found the thing, but that I'm doing now that I think I'll be with kind of through the rest of my working career anyway. But I looked at the resources that I had, and I had this home. And I said, I have a little bit of money in the bank. I have this home. And it turned out I had a burning desire that I did not know where it came from. And it was not logical
Yeah.
to make my home a beautiful place. And if I ask myself that question now, I think as when I grew up, we touched on it at the beginning. We were often, I don't want to say homeless, but we lived in a tent for a while. We lived in a truck for a while.
Oh, wow.
We didn't have a lot of means, and we lived in communal houses with other families, big group homes. Um, and even my time in Africa, those weren't my homes I was living in, they were other people's homes. And now I was an adult. I was 40 years old at this point, and even though I had owned property in San Diego, those weren't my homes really. And so I
Hmm.
owned this home, and I felt the burning desire to make it my place in the world. I think also partly having traveled so much and never having a place to really hang my hat. And when I was in Africa, when I came back to the
Yeah.
US at 36 years old, I had a backpack. I didn't have a cell phone. I didn't have a car. I didn't have any plates, dishes, anything like that. Now I had, been back from Africa a few years and working at that point. So, it was maybe 4 or 5 years that I had been back. And so anyway, I poured my love oddly into the home that I'm now in, that you see me in. Uh,
Yeah, you can see the
yeah.
background, which is one of the signature pieces in this home that is now slightly famous.
I
So,
mean, it's well known in certain circles in San Francisco because what I was able to
mhm.
do was utilize the property. It's 4 bedrooms, 5 bedrooms, depending if you count the office or not. But I was able to use it early days back in, I think, 2013, 14, something like that, 10 years ago or more, as an Airbnb short-term rental. And I had,
And that was right when Airbnb was starting.
well, Airbnb
Because I remember
started in 2000.
it hadn't been around very
Yeah,
long.
it started in 2007,
Yeah.
but they didn't pick up traction until after 2010. Um,
Yeah.
And, I think, yeah, by like 2013, 12, 13, I was renting fairly actively on Airbnb and working on the property at the same time, trying to improve it, make it, you know, beautiful, make it my home, make it something that I loved. And that short-term rental producing income helped me kind of to survive until the point where I realized, I want to do this on a larger scale. And so now, I guess it's been almost 5 years ago now, I pivoted from more of a design focus. And I guess I shouldn't short circuit that story. The property became very
Yeah.
popular. We ended up renting it not only for overnight stays, but also for photo shoots and productions. The property got very well known by Airbnb through the short-term rental, but then other brands and things started to rent the property. And ultimately, I guess the apex of that storyline is that Airbnb hired me as a senior designer on their team, working on helping hosts design their properties. And that was for me the culmination of that part of my journey, which was into design, back to creativity, back to the arts, um, and being recognized by Airbnb as a professional level designer was, that was awesome. But
Yeah, it was pretty cool, pretty
it was very,
great. Yeah.
and also,
I think you also utilized in the your early Airbnb days, um, the hosting side of things. So it wasn't just that you were allowing people to come into your property. You really engaged with your guests and you were a super host in your area in San Francisco and like went to events and stuff with your guests. So you shot up in popularity not just because your property was beautiful, which it was and still is, but also because people wanted to hang out with you and you were a local and you could recommend restaurants and bars and fun things to do.
yeah.
So that was a cool element. And also when you started renting it out for photo shoots and stuff, that was another thing that garnered you a lot of popularity was people got to meet you and engage with
I'd
you.
say there's definitely some truth to that, but in terms of that period of time working in the design field, I think the property certainly got a lot more attention than I did.
Well, yeah, for
It
sure,
was
but you helped.
I certainly played my role, but the
Yeah.
property definitely got more notoriety than I did. And what I mean by that is it was featured in magazines and articles. I was also part of that story, but it was the property. And you might ask, why did that happen? It was also timing. That was when Instagram really first started to blow up. Influencers were wanting to use the space and rent the space in order to be able to shoot aspirational lifestyle content. And that was just a very special time for,
It still happens that I see pictures and ads, and I'm like, that's my friend's apartment. Like, that's my friend's house in San Francisco. That's the
yeah,
background. I still see stuff all the
yeah,
time. It's so
yeah.
funny.
It's still,
Like, so many brands, big brands, used it to film commercials, and yeah,
yeah. I
it's
wouldn't
cool.
recommend it if I had it to do over again. I'm like, okay, this is my business model. I'm going to turn this property into the number one photo studio in San Francisco as a residential non-commercial property. That wouldn't be a good business venture. In fact, that is what happened. It became the number one, certainly Airbnb for a time, and also photo production venue, non-commercial, but and
Yeah.
it's, I think, still does quite well in that respect. But in any case, that time with Airbnb came to an end right about the pandemic. I was leaving that. I had worked with them for about a year and realized that role was becoming corporate again, and I didn't want that journey
Yeah.
for myself anymore. It was really wonderful experience, super enjoyable, great team of people. But I did choose to leave that. Um, I didn't know exactly what I was going to again, but I knew it needed to be a little different. I really loved the design journey. And what ultimately, after another year or two, I figured out was that I wanted to push into real estate development. And that's where we are now. And I needed a bigger project. And so I looked around the country and I found an opportunity to buy 8.5 acres with rivers and sunrise and sunset views. And I'm working on that project now. I've been working on it for 3 years. It's going to become, well, it kind of already is, a cabin community. And this is in the North Georgia mountains. And it's where I could afford to take this risk and do this adventure. Also, I could see that the short-term rental regulations, even 4 or 5 years ago, were tightening, and I needed to go somewhere where, if I was going to do a residential project, I wouldn't put myself or any future investors in jeopardy from that not being an opportunity anymore. Definitely
Yeah.
from this, we're pivoting off into commercial properties. We'll be doing hotels from this. And we're starting to build now a real development company with all of the back end support and a great team of people. And it's a super exciting time.
Wow.
So, yeah, as the cabin community kind of comes together, and um, I think we have two of the ultimately six cabins that are up and available for rental. But ultimately, that by next year, I think will be four, maybe six the year after that. But by then, we'll have pivoted into our first boutique hotel.
Wow. And I mean, I remember you telling me when you started doing design work that you wanted to design a hotel one day, like from the interior side of things. And so it's just, yeah, it's so amazing to be able to say something and then just kind of watch it happen, as you develop and as you grow. And it's kind of what you said earlier about when you had to take a beat, and just kind of see where you were led. And it's like you just started doing things that you loved and that you were good at, and it found you. It just came to you. So I think a lot of people put pressure on themselves sometimes that they have to know and they have to make a decision right away. And it's just do things you love little bit by little bit, and you will be guided. You were so divinely guided on this journey. It's been so fun and inspiring to watch.
Thanks. But kind of something that I think is important to share, which is I was really not good at design when I first started. I would say I had very little facility. And that's probably been true of most of the things that I have ultimately worked on. I was always willing to work hard and to learn and to continue to grow and challenge myself. But the reality is, when I first started, design, or even in the development work when I went to Africa, or when I worked for the private equity firm developing large scale energy projects, in none of those situations would I say that I was very good or anywhere near where I ultimately ended those journeys.
Hmm.
And with design, it's, I think, even easier because I can see the pictures photographically of where I started and what I
Yeah.
iterated on and kept iterating and kept iterating until, something felt right. The design of something felt right. And at the beginning, I was just trusting my own kind of inner voice and journey to lead me to something beautiful that resonated with me. As I now understand design in a slightly different way, um, you know, it's I can still design something that I love, but we can do many versions of that. For example, I had to learn how to do a cabin or a rustic vibe for the projects that we're working on now. And my first few efforts into that, I would say were, not sure. But as, again, I progress and think about it more, it was the same with designing my first new construction build, moving from smaller remodels to bigger remodels to first small new construction to then larger new construction that I actually designed the entire house. And so it's iterative, and we just,
Yeah.
start from very, very humble beginnings. but we just keep learning and growing and challenging ourselves. A lot of great things can happen.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, and I think also, even you said starting from humble beginnings, that kind of links back into what was going to be my next question about money stories. And you touched several times on when you were younger, not having had a lot, and, then working really hard because having money was important to you. Um, your sort of growth into your money story, would you say, how has that impacted your journey? Because for sure, some of the earlier career decisions you made, it sounds like, were for safety and security to make sure that you had money. So as you kind of then had your early success, the things that you're doing now sure are involve a bit more risk. And how has your relationship with money evolved?
Well, that is a very interesting and difficult question to answer. What I will say is, I think it's one lens through which we need to evaluate decisions. I
Hmm.
also mentioned that I wanted to live an adventurous life when I was, kind of in my mid to late 30s. I think the
Yeah.
reason I could say that is that I had already kind of proven to myself that I could support myself. So that I needed that first. So I ticked the box
Yeah.
on, okay, you can support yourself. And not only can you support yourself, you can support a partner too if you need to. So for me, knowing that, and just in the back of my mind, that at any time I was creative enough and worked hard enough where I could support myself in the world. So that's kind of the backstory to then being able to say, okay, now let's look at it through another lens, which is life through an adventurous lens. And it's not to say the money stuff went away, it just became less
Yeah.
relevant, less important, especially in Africa where cost of living was very low and I was being paid, more than adequately for my lifestyle there. Um, Coming
Yeah.
back to the US, money challenges really presented themselves again, the hamster wheel of,
Yeah, and in one of the most expensive cities in the world, right? You went from Africa to San Francisco.
and
That's pretty
it's still
intense.
an expensive place to live here in San Francisco, but at the time it was by far, that in New York and maybe, Tokyo were some of the most expensive places in the world. So it was a challenging place to try to, do what I was about to do. In any case, money was I didn't have a lot of resources, a ton of resources, because I had traveled in between my time of Africa. In fact, I didn't really mention it, but in the going back and forth between the left brain and the right brain, the creative side happened when I would quit my corporate jobs or my work. I would then maybe travel for a year or travel for 6 months, and I would take drawing and language classes and do other things. And so I balanced that very linear thinking during my corporate time with times of completely at one point I did art projects, sculpture projects, and things, and tried to get into art school, which I only applied to the very elite art schools, and I didn't get in. So that was a wonderful opportunity that didn't happen, and
Well, their
no,
loss.
I'm glad it didn't work out. I had a different journey in store for myself, but
Yeah.
I didn't know that at the time. In any case, we go back and forth, and I think it's good to do that in order to check things. But with respect to money, sometimes it was a priority, and sometimes it wasn't. In the course of my career, I am because of my I think early childhood, I am a little bit risk averse in terms of I do
Mm.
want to, live a life of some degree of comfort and security. At the same time, I don't really see myself as a super risky person, but because of my time as an investment manager and working on investing, I've come to understand that we can make decisions, and we can look at them through the lens of, a base case, a low risk, a high risk, upside, downside. And often I think about many of my decisions in that way, both for my life and career choices, but also, the investments that I'm leading now. I think about those in that way as well. I think life, and young people today, I think, are looking at it quite a bit differently in terms of money not being the penultimate. It's the freedom, the
Yeah.
quality of life that are more important. And I think I started that early for my generation and then my time, but many other people were doing it as well. But I think for me, that's still important, is to balance that at all times. I also am a firm believer, if you really do something that you're deeply interested in, and I will risk the word passionate about. And then you couple that with constant learning and effort and getting mentorship and using all of the available tools and resources from the internet. And these days with AI and leaning on those tools, which I am, I was on AI this morning trying to ask it to help me value assets that I'm going to present to investors, problems that, quite honestly, were pretty challenging for my little brain. And I
Yeah.
found a lot of clarity. So we have tools and resources now that we can draw on, and we should. But we've always had tools and resources. These are new tools and resources that allow us to stabilize some of that creative with financial riskiness. It's a balance. And so I've had to balance, but
Yeah.
definitely framed by what you mentioned, which was, some degree of lack of resources when I was young and some desire to remain stable, but balancing that with a creative, more interesting life. Um, to now, I believe, honestly, if I pour myself into what I'm doing, I have no fear. I tell my business partners this all the time. It may or may not play out, but that if we do this very, very well, we will be successful and we won't have to worry about money. So, if we don't, then obviously it'll fail. But let's just take the money part of it out of it. We're constantly looking at returns and
Yeah.
investment, but we have to pursue that as if it's going to be successful, and put the fear and the worry, which takes a lot of energy, aside. It's there,
Yes, it does.
especially when you're involving other people's money, which, I think for those of us that are managing other people's money, often the real way to treat that is even more importantly than our own. There was a moment in time where I decided to grow this thing, that it needed to grow past me and my capabilities and abilities and financial means and resources. And so it was a really important time for my growth, and that happened a few years back. But yeah, money is a very dynamic relationship. I still have a dynamic relationship with it. But at the end of the day, I'm much more interested in realizing this work. And if I am able to realize this work, without a doubt, we will be financially successful.
Yeah. Wow. Good answer.
Thanks.
Good answer. So, reflecting on your whole journey, um, and whatever point you think was your biggest rock bottom, so arguably before you got into design, I'm guessing, but I might be wrong. What would you now tell yourself in your lowest point as advice?
I think that I would tell myself to continue to trust myself, that it's going to be okay, that you will figure it out. Believe in yourself, um, and just keep iterating and trying things. And, I think when I got older, I realized that our down times feel like they'll last forever.
Mm,
And we forget that about our up times. Well, forget that about our downtimes, is that we think it'll last forever, but change is inevitable, and we're not going to stay down, indefinitely. We're also not going to get to stay up indefinitely. and to know that things change, especially just given time and effort. If you put effort out there, things will change. You'll get through it, and just keep persevering. At the end of the day, you have to just keep persevering. As an entrepreneur, I would say there are moments quite frequently where it feels like everything's kind of falling apart. And
Yeah.
just you got to lean into those moments and lean into the uncertainty. Um, Sometimes it's wonderful if you have people around you that you can receive support from, but at the end of the day, you also have to give yourself that love and that support. Trust yourself, believe in yourself. Look back on the moments when you pushed through in your life, difficult, challenging times, and realize that this is another one of those, and you have new skills and resources, and you'll push through this one similarly to that last one.
Yeah. Trusting.
Mhm. And you got to trust the universe, and you got to
Definitely.
listen. You know, you got to
Yeah.
listen to what the universe is trying to tell you. You
Yeah.
you mentioned it earlier, and I think it's an important point that, and maybe it was in your write up before we talked, which is, the most painful moments, and certainly in my life, are what you've identified when change was coming and I was resisting it, mostly out of fear of
Mm.
uncertainty. And so then I started to have, interpersonal problems, maybe with my colleague or boss at work, or things were becoming dissatisfying. I noticed that I start to complain more when I'm not a complaining person. These are the moments where, at least in my life, I was resisting what the universe was trying to tell me with all, you know, uh, wealth of resource and input, that it's time to make a change. And if I resist that change, or am unable to make that change for whatever reason, fear or resources, things can get quite unpleasant and feel very
Yeah.
uncomfortable. And when we're in those uncomfortable moments, we really need to challenge ourselves and ask ourselves, why? Is it because of that other person or that other event, or is it because we're resisting the change?
Yeah. And they say that nothing will be presented to you that you can't handle. But yeah, sometimes easier said than done.
And I
So,
would piggyback that by saying the universe will keep giving us the same challenges until we figure out how to overcome them.
absolutely.
Same
Absolutely.
relationship type partners, same work type challenges, whatever it is, the universe, or we'll find our way to a similar challenge until we figure out how to progress and grow past them.
Yeah, definitely. Um, okay. Well, if people want to check out some of your amazing work and follow your journey, including your current where you're sitting right now, where can people find you? What are the best, like your website,
Yeah.
socials?
So I'm not actually very active. I should be. It's one of these things that we all know. I should be more active on social. You can find me at uh, Michael Grova on Instagram. Maybe you can tag that.
I'll put everything in the show
Yeah.
notes.
So
Yeah.
Instagram would be one way to do it. And I believe there are links to a Silvara, which is our current cabin community project. As far as kind of where, I came from with respect to design, that's the property there. And that company, if you will, is called Mission Loft. Also, you can find that on Instagram, independent of myself. And so those, I'm on LinkedIn as well, but those would be the places that you can find me.
Yeah. Mission Loft, I'm very fond of that. I helped with that Instagram for a short time, so
Yeah. We're
love
not
that
active at
page.
all on
So,
Mission Loft, but we
yeah.
progressed past it. It still does exist. Right now, it's the focus is Silvara and this cabin
Yeah.
community. But hopefully, by the time some people see this, we'll be into our next project.
Yeah. Exciting. Okay, well, thank you so much, Michael. That was really very expansive, and I think will be really helpful for people that are wanting to make, a like quite a significant career shift.
I hope so.
So,
I hope it
really
helps.
appreciate it.
Thanks, Megan.
Yeah, definitely. Okay. Thank you.